Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation. I'm happy to see so many familiar faces and some new ones as well. Tonight, we are joined by Matthew Papuchis, an award-winning corporate communications strategist and internal communications leader. Tonight, he will be sharing with us about his first book, which he recently published in March 2021, a nonfiction work entitled A Little Birdie Told Me, A Journey to Find Hope, Happiness, and the Wings to Fly. Reminder, please remain muted during the presentation. You can send any questions you have throughout in the chat. And as always, there will be an opportunity at the end to unmute for a Q&A. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please make sure to check out our website and register to join us for more upcoming events. Without further ado, Matthew, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Dottie. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining this evening. I don't think there's a World Series game on, is there, Anthony? I think I fortunately fell in between two games. Maybe there is. I don't know. But
I'm not following it, Matt. I don't care. I don't like it.
That's all right, as long as the Astros don't win. But all right. So thank you for letting me speak with you all for a few minutes this evening. I will share a little PowerPoint that I will walk through, and I figured I would just tell you a little bit more about myself and hang on a second.
We're going to give it 1 minute. It seems like he dropped off.
Here he comes.
I kicked myself off trying to share my screen, so sorry for that. All right, here we go. Got the PowerPoint up. Thanks for bearing with me. So yes, I did write my first, probably my only, to be honest with you, nonfiction book. I wrote it about a year ago. In fact, I finished it in October of 2020, but it was published in April of this year. And it was about my observations and my experiences being out of work throughout much of 2020, thanks to the COVID pandemic. And let me stop sharing for a second because then I can turn my video back on. There we go. All right. So like many people, I found myself unfortunately out of work starting in April of 2020. I worked for a hospitality company. I worked for Marriott International, which is of course based in Montgomery County. And even though I now live in South Florida, I was working for the Marriott headquarters group based in Bethesda, but working fully remote from down here. And I was feeling great about things. I mean, it was a couple great years for us with Marriott, and lots of growth, lots of opportunity. And then next thing you know, this little virus that started out as, yeah, we were kind of aware of it. Some of our hotels in China were impacted. Within weeks, clearly, it became what we now know it as, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, like many in my industry, not just in the hotel world, but throughout travel and hospitality, I found myself out of work for the first time, as I put in the book, since I was 14. I'd always worked. I always tried to contribute to society in that way. And now that I have 3 kids, finding myself out of work, it wasn't necessarily from the financial standpoint. And I put this in the book, of course, that fortunately, with a support network and my wife working and some money we had saved up, we were okay financially. But it was really more about the psychological effect being out of work had on me, and the fact that I was feeling like a failure almost, because I had played a certain role for however many years, like I said, since I was 14. So that goes back to 1994. So for more than 25 years, I was used to having a job in some capacity. And my oldest son just turned 12. So for the last 12 years, I've been providing for a family. Now that I have 3 kids, so I felt like there were many days where, while I tried to enjoy that downtime with them and really embrace the quality time and savor the fact that for the first time, I mean, I was joking, I was a few minutes late for tonight's event because I was rushing home from my middle son's flag football game. That was after dropping my older son off at baseball practice, which I'll pick him up at 9 p.m. later this evening. But it was nice to not have to worry about that for a few weeks. And in the beginning, during the quarantine period, that's what I really looked at it as. This is going to be a nice 3-4 week break. I'll be back at work by the middle of May. And, we'll all look back at this time and say it wasn't that nice. And obviously that wasn't the case. So that's really what inspired me to write this book is sort of how I dealt with that period of time. But, I'll start at the beginning, I guess, a little bit about the guy who wrote A Little Birdie Told Me. I am from Montgomery County, and there's a picture of me at Butler's Orchard in Poolsville, just to prove to you that I actually am from Montgomery County. And there I am throughout my childhood. Went to Quince Orchard High School in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Go Cougars. There's my high school graduation picture. And then I, of course, was an editor for the college newspaper at Towson University called the Tower Light. So I stayed in the state of Maryland for college until, and then, worked for Marriott and stayed in the DC area until 2013, which is when we moved here. And now, here's a look at my family. I was actually at I was fortunate to do a book signing at a brand new Barnes & Noble here in South Florida in Broward County in Coral Springs last week. So there's my wife, Christy, and our 3 children, Dylan, again, my oldest, Noah in the Maryland shirt. Coincidentally enough, his flag football team is Maryland this year. His coach actually played for Maryland in the mid-'80s. So that's kind of a nice coincidence as well, the Maryland connection. And there's our daughter, Emma, who just turned 7 this past summer. And my mom on the left, who's living down here in South Florida as well, but she's also a Montgomery County native and went to Kennedy High School in the 70s. And really here, this is why I wrote the book. These 3 right here, there they are again. There's Dylan, Emma, and Noah. And the reason why I wanted to share them and make sure that I pointed them out and mentioned them at the beginning is because they're featured throughout the book. There are lots of the stories that I have included are about, how I can continue to be a role model for them and try to instill life lessons in them, even during the days where I was feeling like I didn't have much to offer the world. I mean, they really became my focus. And it all started when my older son, Dylan, who I tried to Photoshop, he had a blue Gatorade mustache there. He was in 4th grade in the spring of 2020. And he happened to have, this is all online learning, of course, he happened to have an assignment on the Everglades, Everglades National Park, which is about an hour south of us in Homestead, Florida. And it's a place that I'd wanted to see since moving here in 2013, but I never had a chance to do it. Because of what I just mentioned, the baseball practices, the gymnastics lessons, all this, piano lessons, dance class, you name it. And so right around the time that this assignment was due, they reopened the national parks. This was in May of 2020. So about 6 weeks into the quarantine period, after I had built every Lego set in the house, after I had tried every recipe I wanted to try, it was time to get out of the house for a little bit. And it was a perfect time to visit the Everglades, not only because this project was due, but because I think we were all going a little stir crazy. And so it was also really cool because they were not yet charging admission. As part of, I guess, the country's way of encouraging people to visit the national parks and participate in safe, social distancing type activities at the same time. They reopened the national parks in a phased approach. And they weren't charging the admission. So I told them, if you guys, finish your school work early today, because it was all self-paced, we'll get out of the house and we'll go to the Everglades. And they jumped at the chance because they had been cooped up pretty much for 6 weeks as well at that point. So they finished their schoolwork early that day. And so around 11 o'clock, we headed down to the Everglades and we were the only people there. And even though this book is about birding, we didn't see a single thing there other than this grasshopper. which I learned is an eastern grasshopper, which is very popular among Everglades visitors, but not enough to compel somebody to visit there for the first time. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the fact that I was there in the middle of a national park, virtually alone with my 3 kids in the middle of the afternoon on a Thursday. I did not have to worry about rushing home to get them to a practice or a game, or to send an email to somebody that couldn't wait just 5 more minutes. We had the whole park to ourselves. And, it was, not to be hyperbolic or exaggerate, but it was a life-changing activity, because it's what inspired me then to find other places that were a little bit closer. And so that's what I did. When we got home that night, I was like, this is great. And how fun was it to spend the day at the Everglades? But it is still a bit far. And at some point, they might start charging admission again. And, being out of work, I didn't want to frivolously spend money when, we didn't have to. So I researched places in Broward County, closer to my house, that might offer similar experiences. And what I found was that there's a place called the Plantation Preserve Linear Trail, which is about 3 miles from my house, and it's connected to a golf course that's also called Plantation Preserve. And the irony there is that I had been to that golf course probably as many times as I've been to Coolsville Golf Course in my life. Now I've been there 100 times, and I had no idea, zero clue, that within 15 yards of where the driving range is this linear trail that is known as one of the top, birding and nature destinations in South Florida. So the Everglades trip was the Thursday before Mother's Day. So that Sunday was Mother's Day, and I actually saw my mom on Mother's Day for the first time since March. We hadn't seen each other since the quarantine started. And I was telling her about this activity at the Everglades, and I said, hey, by the way, I found this place near us called the Plantation Preserve Trail. Do you want to come see it with me this week? And she said, yeah. So we went the following Thursday, and that's really where it all began, in terms of just, finding myself being able to escape and disappear for an hour or an hour and a half, and wander along these trails. It's what I learned would, I didn't know it at the time. And of course I put this in the book. This was my first trip there. I showed up that day thinking, all right, yeah, let's go look for birds. Why not? What else are we going to do? But this turned out to be the single biggest factor in my ability to get through that tough period. And so when I went back to work in September, I was fortunate that I was rehired by Marriott after about 5 months being unemployed. And it was at that point where I sat back and said, I don't think I would have gotten through this difficult time, as crazy as this sounds, if it weren't for the birding. And on top of that, I started to pile up all of the lessons that I had learned while doing it. And that's what the book is actually about. So the book is like, 50% my sort of journey, like I said, during that time period, but each chapter is based on a specific lesson that I learned while birding, or I was retaught, you could say, because some of them are pretty straightforward. Things like being prepared when you go out and try to see a bird. It helps to know what you're looking for or what you're listening for. And so there were some funny moments where we're stumbling around in the middle of nowhere trying to find something. And my son would say, well, what does the red woodpecker sound like, Dad? And I had no clue. I probably should know that before we came out here. So again, it just sort of, I said to myself, there was so much that I learned that not only applies to this activity of bird watching and bird photography, but it applies to every aspect of my life, from parenting to the workplace as a leader or an employee, to just a friend and person and the relationships that I have. And so that's what the book is about. It's about how can we take these little nuggets of wisdom that I learned and apply them in other places. And so I figured I would read just a couple of excerpts from a few pages here. And it started with chapter 1 is called positivity. So chapter 1 is all about positivity, and I took a picture of a cardinal that day. And it's admittedly not a great picture, but that's not that important. I'll tell you why here in one moment. So my mom and I went to the linear trail for the first time on May 12th, I think it was. But we met up again the following week. And it was my 4th time there, because in between the 2 Thursdays where we, this was the Thursday following that first visit where I saw that limpkin on the last page. I had gone twice in between that because I was just so enamored with it. But I didn't want my mom to necessarily know that, so I mentioned it to her that morning. And one of the things that I put in here was because I didn't want her to feel left out, because we had gone to this trail the week before, and I felt guilty about going there by myself, but she was totally fine with it. And here I'll read a couple pages here. As my mom and I wandered through the preserve, I said to her, I really want to find a bright red bird. I don't even know why, but I want to get a photo of a cardinal or something. Now, this was before I had read any books, and also before my days of using any apps or websites to track observations and seek out potential sites where birds can be found. This is to emphasize the point that my random desire to see a cardinal that day was just that. It was random. Not only was it random, but I didn't know if it was even a realistic desire either. My knowledge of the common species in Florida was still fairly limited at this point, meaning non-existent. So I said it without knowing if it was within the realm of possibility. And no offense to my mom, she probably didn't know either. The other thing I would be remiss to say here is that I said in the preface of this book that this journey was about the lessons that I learned on my own last summer. But it goes beyond that. This lesson I'm about to share was 100% influenced by my mother. At the risk of sounding too philosophical and perhaps cheesy, it's almost as if my mom helped me provide this key lesson for me at the earliest days of my journey, was the tipping point, and is what allowed me to then leave the nest. See, told you it was cheesy. And was the guidance that I needed before I sought out adventures on my own. Because sometimes you need those sorts of things in order to have the clarity to do so. After I shared my desire to see a cardinal with my mom, my mother, ever positive, would say things such as, well, just keep saying it in your head and thinking it, and the universe will bring it to you. To be honest, my reactions to those statements from my dear mother are usually a combination of, okay, Mom, with a slight eye roll. It's not that I didn't think positive thinking was a good way to go through life. I was just slightly more cynical, I guess you could say, especially at that time, as much as I probably didn't want to admit it. My mom was the most positive person I've ever known. She has been giving me that kind of advice for years, and it wasn't because she was simply a mother trying to reassure her son. It's just who she is, how everybody knows her. This comes naturally to me. But here's where the lesson comes into play. When we got home that day, I saw dozens of birds and took about 15 pictures, but unfortunately nothing red as far as the eye could see. But I uploaded my photos to my computer when I got home and started to click through. As I got to the last photo of the day, there he was, a bright red cardinal perched on a high branch about 50 or 60 feet away from me. You may be curious how I didn't know I took that photo. Simple. One is it was off in the distance a bit and I couldn't tell what it was. And two, sometimes the perspective at which we are coming from makes the color of a bird hard to determine. But I definitely noticed something up there that day that compelled me to snap away. So I texted my mom right away and said, Mom, what do you call this? Along with a photo of the cardinal I had unknowingly photographed not even an hour earlier. She replied, I call it exactly what we were talking about. You thought about it and brought it to you, followed by just a few heart emojis for good measure. My mom is always good for a few of those, a few too many, if you ask me. But like I said, it's part of her good-natured spirit. She followed that up with the following quote, if you ever doubt the universe is conspiring good things for you, remember your cardinal. I sat there for a second, smiling and somewhat bewildered. Could there be more to this whole concept of thinking positive thoughts and trusting the universe to take care of the rest than I was willing to admit? Let it be said, this is not necessarily an original concept. As much as I admire my mother's wisdom, I am not crediting her for developing this philosophy. In fact, there are many books on this subject that discuss this concept of the power of positive thinking, including that one, The Power of Positive Thinking. But the one she talked about that day was one called E Squared by Pam Grout, which is described on Amazon as saying could best be described as a lab manual with simple experiments to prove once and for all that reality is malleable, that conscientiousness trumps matter, and that you shape your life with your mind to prove there really is a positive, loving, totally hip force in the universe. This is a heady concept, but also fascinating to think about, that maybe, just maybe, we have more control over these things than we realize we do. I don't propose that I'm an expert and haven't done any of the research that these authors have done, so I'm not claiming to own this philosophy as my own either. In fact, I don't even know how it all works. I'm not suggesting this is like Aladdin, where you rub a lamp and a genie pops out and your wish comes true. By the way, I don't think these authors think that either. But if you're thinking to yourself, gee, Matt, if only it were that easy, just put it out there and make it happen. I get it, trust me. But if you allow yourself to contemplate for a moment, why not think that way? Because as I shared before, while I've never described myself as a bastion of positivity, I've always believed in looking at things with an optimistic lens and seeing challenges as opportunities. If for no other reason, it certainly doesn't hurt to look at life that way. And I'll skip to the last part of this chapter here to wrap this one up. As I close this chapter, here's an additional tidbit to ponder. The bird I saw more than any other that summer, no matter where I went, was the northern cardinal, including Tallahassee during a road trip to see my brother and his family, which continued into Delaware to see my dad and my stepmother, Wendy, where the same was true. My family and I went to Hilton Head, South Carolina in the middle of August for one final getaway before school started, a trip that was almost already paid for a year ago, by the way. And the first bird I saw when I stepped out onto the balcony after we arrived was, once again, a northern cardinal. And as I saw more of him, the more vivid he became, and the more often he appeared, the closer and more visible he would be. I have some photos that appear as though we are standing next to each other chatting about life. The photo on the cover of this book is one such example. And even though I saw dozens of cardinals over the next few months, in my mind and in my heart, it was always the same one. The first one I saw in May of 2020, the day it really all began, with my mom from a distance, when I didn't even realize it and didn't realize just how much I needed to see it. One final note. I alluded to this already when I said it was the last photo I took that day. It's because when I saw the cardinal on the way out, we were already exiting the trail, headed back to our cars. And when I stopped to photograph it, my mom didn't see it, only I did. When I said I saw something but wasn't sure what it was, I at least saw something. My mom didn't see it at all. This is not a knock on her vision, because she's pointed out plenty of birds to me that she saw first. But maybe it's because he appeared for me, and only for me, as a sign, and not necessarily for anyone else, not even my own mother. You see, the cardinal, yes, the one who seemed to show up that day for me when I didn't even know it, remained with me all summer to serve as a reminder, as my mom said, that the universe was indeed conspiring good things for me, and that the lesson on positivity would be the basis for all subsequent chapters and lessons that now follow. Without that stay positive and think optimistically concept top of mind throughout the rest of my endeavors, I likely would not have experienced the same types of revelations that summer. This was the day I was finally starting to get that there was something bigger at play. But the journey was only just beginning. All right, so that was chapter one, and it was a crazy experience because I saw this bird, and like I said, it wasn't a great photo, but the fact that I said earlier that day, I want to see a cardinal, and my mom said, well, just keep saying it out loud and it'll happen. And then I didn't realize I even saw it until I got home later that morning. Next chapter, though, that I want to share, the excerpt is from chapter 6, where it talks about stepping out of your comfort zone and stepping, putting in miles, as I call it here, if you want to see something specific. And, that's the same sort of philosophy that I had when I moved to Florida a few years ago, is that sometimes in life you have to sort of make a decision and go for it and realize that, you can't do it all by staying in one place. And so that's what inspired me to go out about 90 minutes away to look for this bird, which is called the crested caracara. So here I'll share just a minute or a couple passages from here. All right. So we saw this bird, actually, we went to a specific park looking for one, and we didn't see one. But I was driving, it was around 2 o'clock. I realized they hadn't eaten lunch. And I knew that if we had gotten home and my wife said, "What do the boys have for lunch?" And I said, "A Snickers bar and a bag of Doritos," that probably would have been frowned upon. So we got out of there around 2 o'clock to go to Subway. So as we were driving, we were headed towards Subway, and I saw, from a faraway distance, this bird sitting in a tree. And I said, I'm going to make a U-turn and try to grab a picture of that. So that's where this chapter, this excerpt begins. Because of his size and because of my vantage point, I did not need to get out of my car. The bug spray continues to get a day off. I lowered the passenger side window and buckled my seatbelt. And yes, I wore one, and that detail is for you, Mom. I leaned over, zoomed in, and clicked away. I had a great view and felt confident I was able to do this incredible species justice with the photos I had taken, as much as a photo can anyway. I was able to preview the shots right then and there on the camera and could tell that they turned out great. But for good measure, I took about a half dozen more, because why not? That's the benefit of not having to use film. All in all, I took about 20 shots, mission accomplished. We headed to lunch, and I drove there like I was Tom Brady. Maybe I should have said Tom Cruise to keep up with the mission theme. But to be honest, I felt more like a 7-time Super Bowl champion than I did anything else. And the boys were excited too. Maybe they were excited for me. Maybe they get joy by seeing me get joy. As parents, we are happy when our children are happy, and we are sad when they are sad. Perhaps our children are more emotionally in tune than we give them credit for, and they mirror our emotions just as we do. Regardless, they too were on cloud nine as we continued down the road. On second thought, maybe their joy was because they knew lunch was next. I only tease. I knew they were happy, and it was not lost on me then, nor is it now, that I'm happy for Dad was probably the reason why. I love those kids. All right, let me just say, let me skip to one part here. Okay. There's one other thing you should know about that day's outing. And if you think I'm throwing this in for dramatic effect, I will gladly show you my cell phone records. On the way home, and still feeling like Tom Brady, I received a phone call from a recruiter from a company I'd been interviewing with all summer. And yes, I mean all summer. I began the interview process June 9th, the day before my 40th birthday. I went through 6 rounds, and she delivered the news that the company had decided to move forward with another candidate. I fought back the tears as I told her I understood the decision, which, truth be told, I didn't. But my 2 boys were watching, which is why I felt that I needed to hide my emotions. Now, I want to clarify 2 things. First, the tears were not because of the rejection directly. In my 17 years in the corporate world, I had applied for jobs, and despite my confidence I was qualified, I did not get them. It happens to most of us, if not all of us. So no, I do not usually get emotional, let alone have to hold back tears when I don't land a job. In this case, though, it wasn't about this job. On top of that, it wasn't about me either, meaning I wasn't feeling sorry for myself. As I've said many times before, despite being out of work for the first time in my career, I would consider myself very fortunate, and I still do. So the tears were not about me, the job, or my own personal circumstance. It was about the thought that I was somehow letting my family down. My boys, who again were 5 feet away from me, and who I have had countless conversations with over the years about how they can grow up to be anything they want and have it. And here I was, feeling as though I was somehow a failure and to some degree a fraud. I stayed positive 99% of the time I was looking for work, but occasionally I let feelings of self-defeat and doubt creep in. And in those moments, So just hearing those recruiters' words echoing in my head almost in slow motion. Well, sometimes there just simply isn't any comfort to be found. Second thing I want to explain is that showing emotion is nothing to be ashamed of, but I felt like I needed to be strong for them. I had done my best throughout those trying months to not give them any reason to worry about money, about my psyche, about me in general. Our kids shouldn't have to worry about us. They're kids. But as I said, they feel our happiness. They also feel our sadness too. As the call ended, the three of us sat there quietly and none of us wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. They didn't ask me, but as I sat there behind a dark pair of sunglasses without saying a word, they both knew what the phone call was, and they both knew how it made me feel. Around the same time, they both sort of let out a simple, "Sorry, Dad, it'll be okay." Like I said, I love those kids. All right, so I drove home that day, starting on cloud nine, like I said, because this was a bird that I wanted to see, and my two boys and I on the road having an adventure, and when we saw it, like I said, I felt like Tom Brady. I felt like I was on top of the world, and within moments it was snatched away, and that was basically how it felt, for those 4 or 5 months. It was like feeling on top of the world 1 second, and I put this in the book. I could be standing at the stove making a grilled cheese, feeling happy as a clam, whistling, and the next thing you know, I would just be overcome with grief and sadness for no apparent reason. And that was sort of the back and forth sort of tug of war that I had all summer. But then, by the time I got home, since we were about an hour away, which, as I put in the book, one of the benefits of venturing so far out, I had a lot of time to sort of get my thoughts together as I drove home. I realized that maybe the only thing that mattered that day was that quality time with my kids. And that's what I'll remember the most. All these months later and in the years to come, it's not about that dumb job I didn't get. It's about the fact that we had a great day together, and we don't have them often enough. One other chapter I'll share briefly here is one about the importance of mentors and peers and teachers and coaches in your lives. And this is inspired by this photo here, which again is admittedly not my best. That is a photo of a summer tanager, but I was not aware it was a summer tanager when I took it. This is called Chapter 11 on peers, mentors, and experts. All right. Okay. This is a chapter that I feel like I've teased more than any other since I wrote this book. It's been a common thread in every previous chapter thus far. But think of those teasers I referred to in the opening sentence of this chapter as the movie trailer, and this is the actual movie. Because it cannot be overstated, if there's anyone out there who thinks they can do it all and learn it all by themselves, not only would I encourage that person to go back and reread some of the stories in this book, but I encourage them to close their eyes and think back to the person who taught them how to read in the first place. I'll start with a photo of this chapter's title page, which is going back to the last chapter. Not my best. It wasn't chosen for the quality of the photograph, but for the lesson it represents and the reinforcement it provides to emphasize the overall theme of this chapter. All right, let me skip to a part here. Okay, so I ran into a birding expert that I met initially online, but then we ended up bumping into each other randomly in a park one day. His name is Steve, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I think that photo you posted a couple of weeks ago from this same park was actually a summer tanager." Now, this next part of the story, in all honesty, makes me seem like a hypothetical person above who thinks they taught themselves how to read. Nah, I'm pretty sure this is a spot-breasted oriole. I had just seen one like 3 days before, and I watched this bird fly from one tree to the next. Unfortunately, the only photo I have is this one, where I'm looking at him from the ground up. But trust me, I'm fairly confident this is a spot-breasted oriole. The picture might not be convincing as it should be, but I saw it. Okay, I don't know if those were my exact words to Steve, but that was pretty much the theme of the conversation. He offered me some more insight into why he thought it was a tanager, including the shape of the beak, which now, if you're looking at the two photos side by side, is quite different from that of an oriole. But for whatever reason, I dismissed it and didn't think about it again. That is until about a month later, I received a message on Facebook from another friend, Bruce, and he said, "FYI, there's a summer tanager on your eat bird list from August. I thought you'd want to know." First of all, thanks, Bruce. Secondly, gulp, Steve, my apologies. Now, we've seen each other once or twice, and I laugh about it now. Again, this is not a huge mistake, but there's a lesson to be found here for sure. The thing to keep in mind is that if a person who turns out to be a little better than us, a little more experienced than us, and just a tad, or in this case, a lot more knowledgeable than us on a given subject, and then voluntarily offers to help us learn something new or attempts to give us advice, we should probably take it. That's not to say we can't offer our perspective as to why we think something is what we thought. If our math teacher tells us 3 + 2 is 5, and we think it's 4, we shouldn't feel embarrassed about telling them why we came to that conclusion, especially if we felt confident about it. But after they explain that we're wrong, and more importantly, why we are wrong, that's when we may need to allow ourselves to step down just a little bit from the pedestal we placed ourselves upon and think maybe I should listen to that. Now, I'm going to share one final part from this chapter before I share one more excerpt from the following chapter. All right. Okay. All right. All right, with this, I'll close this chapter with a final thought that ties back to the same story of Noah and his piano. So briefly, I'll just share, I want to read this part of the book. So Noah, my middle son, plays piano. And at the start of last school year, they were still doing virtual, and they had a show and tell, a virtual show and tell. And Noah asked if he could play a song on the piano for his classmates. And I was blown away that he had the confidence to want to do that, and he did it, and he played it great. And so I sent a message to his teacher, his piano teacher, and shared the story. And she was touched by me sharing it, but she was also very touched that Noah had the confidence to do that. And so the reason I share that in this chapter is, again, because the things that people teach us and the lessons we learn from these teachers, mentors, coaches, I mean, they carry over into every other aspect of our lives. And so here's Noah, taking the confidence he learned playing the piano, and he's showing that confidence in his schoolwork. And it was, a proud moment for his mother and I, for sure. Okay, so that's why I wanted to just reference that, because this part wouldn't make sense otherwise. All right, I'll close this chapter with a final thought that ties back to the same story of Noah and his piano and the confidence that has now permeated throughout the other parts of his life, namely school. If you are a parent, you already know there's nothing like seeing your child thriving and learning with confidence. The gift, which was delivered to his teacher and her passion for music, was then taught to my son. Is an infinitely greater gift than anything else could be. To tie into that lesson, it's safe to say that this book that I wrote is the physical manifestation of what can happen to us when we become so passionate about a new hobby. When we take the time to learn from others who help us improve, help us get better, help us pursue excellence, help us keep wanting to learn more. As I have shared, after my first visit to the preserve on May 14th, I didn't think that birding would ever lead to any of the growth and learning that would carry over into every other aspect of my life ever since. And writing a book about it would have sounded absolutely ridiculous. So it needs to be said that I certainly would not have learned as many lessons that now fill the pages of this book if it weren't for the generous advice and the friendly help of peers and experts like those who take the time to point out that what we might think is a spot-breasted oriole is actually a summer tanager. All right. So I will share one last chapter. This is probably my favorite, not to give a spoiler alert. This one is about possibilities and sort of having that mindset of anything is possible and never losing sight of the fact that we never know when the next great thing is about to happen to us. It can happen at any second. This chapter's lesson, as we near the end of this book, with just a couple lessons remaining, might actually be the one that can best answer the question I've received the most these last few months, which is why birding? While the lessons I shared in the previous chapters can certainly help answer that question now with relative ease, the truth is that none of them, on their own at least, can answer the question as succinctly as this one individual lesson can. Because when I consider all the other lessons I've learned, the cathartic visits to the places I refer to as my sanctuaries, the long walks spent alone, lost in my own thoughts, the early morning walks with my mom that always seemed to lift my spirits, and the adventures I had when my kids and I were on the prowl looking for a new species. And the engaging discussions I had and the books that I read along the way. None of these can necessarily answer the question of why. At this point, I'm about to tell you, and I can do that with one word: possibilities. I know what you're thinking. It's just the title of this chapter. That's the big reveal. Yes, but the truth is, it is the single best word to use to answer the question I've received the most since I snapped my first picture of a limpkin during my first visit to the preserve, even though I didn't know it was a limpkin. And it's a lesson that I learned that day, and it's one that I've learned every day since, and with hope, it's one that I will learn every day for the rest of my life. And thus, I will repeat it again: possibilities. The second you get out of your car, you never know what you're going to see, but once you step foot on a trail, from that moment forward, the possibility always exists that you will find something special, something rare, something new, something you never expected, something you never even heard of, something that gives you the reason to think anything's possible. You may not always. It's happened to me plenty of times. But the fact is, those previous visits are irrelevant. Regardless of how many times I did or did not see something new or special, with every new adventure, every new park I checked off the list, every 2-week road trip, every 90-minute drive to Martin County, and looked up in the tree, that possibility was always there, and it always will be. When you find yourself at times looking for signs that there is a reason to remain optimistic, if you're not looking in the right places, you likely won't find many, if any, signs at all. In the chapter on perspective, I share that for a variety of reasons, I felt the country had reached a state of polarization, the likes of which I'd never seen in my lifetime. It is enough to make you bow your head and pray to whomever and whatever you need to, but this cannot be the way we want to be living as a society. On top of that, I was in the midst of grappling with a lot of personal demons: the self-doubt, the self-defeat, the guilt for feeling those things when I knew that I still had so much for which to be grateful, the guilt for squandering some of those quiet moments at home with the kids where my mind would drift to some of those darker places. But it was also during some of those more challenging days of my unemployment, the days where I couldn't get out of my own head, the days where I would beat myself up a little as I watched my wife Christy working hard in her home office as I scoured job boards trying not to feel dejected. Those were the days where I felt like I needed something more to cling to. On those days, I realized that not only was the possibility to experience something special and different the single most alluring aspect of this newly discovered passion of mine, it's also the answer to why. And I soon discovered that the lesson on possibilities was the one that I probably needed the most during those trying days too. Because if I could be walking out of the Plantation Preserve linear trail headed to my car and have a Cooper's hawk, a bird I'd never seen before, swoosh by me in a flash, but then land 5 feet away and allow me to take as many photos as I wanted to, well, what other possibilities are out there, for me, for my kids, for my family? We never know. That's what makes it great. That's what gives us hope. That's what gives us reasons to think, why not? And that's what makes it my why. If I could be sitting at the resort pool while on vacation in Hilton Head, hear a strange call that compelled me to get up from my lounge chair and walk around the corner with my camera, because I always had it at that point, and see a bald eagle 10 feet away from me in a random pine tree, then what else might be right around the corner? What possibilities exist even if I don't see them from my current viewpoint? What is out there for me that I don't know about, but could be? And I could find out simply by getting up and away from my comfort zone. Literally, because in this case, that lounge chair was flipping amazing. Knowing something special and unexpected could happen when you weren't even looking was how some of my most memorable stories started. And then, the bird here, I won't get into the details of that one, but again, this is a black-billed cuckoo. Turns out I had no idea what it was. I posted something to Facebook and said, anyone have any idea what this bird is? A friend of mine, Paul, said, dude, you have a black-billed cuckoo. And I said, Paul, help me out here. is this good? Turns out it's one of the rarest species ever seen in that part of Broward County, and had never been seen at that park before. So that was really cool, and I had no idea what it was. And that's really what makes this hobby so alluring, and it's what really sort of reaffirmed my belief that another job is out there, Matt. Another, more good times are ahead, even if you don't realize it right now. So I'll close this by reading one more part of the same chapter. One final tidbit as it relates to possibilities is oftentimes these possibilities that we happen upon have been there all along, almost hiding in plain sight, as the expression goes. One day, about a month into our weekly walks at Plantation Preserve, my mom suggested an alternative, Plantation Central Park. Unlike the preserve, which I'd never been to, I have been to Central Park at least 100 times. I probably spent more time there than any other place since moving to Florida. It's where my sons play baseball, flag football, and tennis, and where all three of my kids have attended summer camp the past 5 years. While I've been to Central Park countless times since 2013, never without rushing from field to field, from Dylan's practice or game to Noah's, or darting out of the park in time to get Emma from gymnastics. Certainly never to enjoy a leisurely stroll with my mom to embrace nature and good conversation. But that day I saw dozens of birds, presumably all of which had been there for years, and once again, I never took the time to notice, to appreciate them, to listen. The highlight was seeing a burrowing owl, but not where one would normally expect to find one, a hole in the ground, as the name suggests. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission has designated nesting locations throughout Broward County that are roped off by piping with signs to caution those to avoid disrupting their slumber. But if you walk by when they're out of the burrow, you can see them fairly easily. And yes, Central Park is one of those locations that has several of the nesting spots. But I didn't see one that day when looking for one in the burrow. Before I could even be disappointed, I looked up, and not even 5 feet away from baseball field 5, where both of my sons have played dozens of games over the years, there he was, perched on a tree. He was sitting there as if that wise old owl was waiting for me, like many of the other birds that have followed that summer would be, to offer his words of wisdom and encouragement. And since baseball field was silent that day and there were no practices to rush to, I finally took the time to listen to what he was saying. And since it was toward the early end of my weekly walks with my mom, I would do the same with all the other little and big birds that offer their own words of wisdom over the next several months. Today, while I'm grateful to be back at work, blessed to have a supportive family, and thankful for everything I have and the lessons that I learned these last few months and will continue to learn, I am aware that so many others are not as fortunate. This, by the way, is a mindset we should always have. It shouldn't take a pandemic for employers to show empathy. It shouldn't take one for us to realize that we should be more grateful for what we have as opposed to complaining about what we don't. I share all this to say that during some of my more challenging moments during the dog days of summer, when my mind started to wander dark and sad places, I tried my best to snap out of it and remember the lesson on possibilities. For anyone reading this who, like I was not so long ago, is looking for answers, looking for something, looking for possibilities, no matter the situation, 10 years from now when COVID is hopefully in the far distant memory. But anytime you find yourself clinging to hope, wondering when your next chapter will start or when that next door will open, just remember a bald eagle may be sitting right around the corner, or better yet, a black-whiskered vireo. Possibility always exists, even if it seems as though it doesn't. It always exists. It always will. Sometimes we just need to stop and pay attention and see the burrowing owl away from his burrow, perched on a tree, eager to pass on his wisdom to us. And sometimes we simply need to close our eyes and take a deep breath before we unknowingly stumble upon that black-billed cuckoo just waiting to be discovered. All right, so thank you for bearing with me there as I read some of the chapters. I've tried to give you a flavor for some of the lessons there that fill the book. And here's a look at it. My Zoom background is making it blend in, but and there's the red cardinal on the cover, and that's a much better photo than the one that I showed that first day, but there he is. So thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity, and maybe a few minutes left if there's any questions, maybe 5 minutes or any comments, questions.
I
Happy
see
to
a
take
couple
it.
questions in the chat. The first one I see is, did you journal your thoughts or experiences and then write from them, or did you write from your memories?
I had, that's a great question. I had shared, so I have a LinkedIn page where I've written some blogs, and I had shared a couple tidbits here and there, but I would say the majority of it was from my memory. And so when I went back to work last September, I found myself at that linear trail by myself, and my head was swirling with all kinds of emotions, obviously that of gratitude first and foremost, because I had found a job again. And I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to write one more blog that, because I had written, like I said, I'd written a bunch that summer that sort of chronicled my journey. And I had mentioned the birds and maybe one or two of them, not many of them, but a couple. And I said, I'm going to do a blog that really pays homage to the birds. And as I was wandering around that day, I said to myself, maybe this could be a book, because that's when I started to add it all up. I was like, oh yeah, I remember that time you were trying to find something that you weren't prepared for it. So there's a lesson on preparation. And then there was another, time where I found something that I really wanted to photograph, and I got a picture of it that was terrible. And so I kept going back to the same spot again and again. And so there's a chapter on the continuous pursuit of excellence and not settling for anything but your best. And so that's when it started to add up. And I said, I'm going to turn this into a book. And I started it on September 4th, and I finished the first draft on October 4th. So it kind of just, flowed out of me, but most of it was through recollection.
The next question I see says, it seems like there's a difference between bird watching and bird hunting. One seems more leisurely and the other takes more persistence and patience. Which one is your favorite?
Well, it depends. There are days where if I'm going out and trying to see a specific bird, like I hunting, by the way, I hope the connotation isn't that I'm killing any of the birds, but that's fine. People want to do that. For me, though, it was more about photography. And there were days where I'd be somewhere where I wasn't looking for anything specific. But then that's when the possibilities of finding something cool comes into play. And then you find yourself being able to enjoy just whatever it is you see. It's definitely much more leisurely. But if there were days like the one where I shared where I drove 90 minutes away looking for that particular bird, that crested car, which is really cool, by the way. I've never seen one of these. They don't have these in Maryland. This is really cool. About the size of a bald eagle. I drove 90 minutes to see that. And I can tell you, if I did not see that driving home, I would have been really disappointed. And then getting the call that I didn't get that job would have made it even worse. So there's some stress though to it, because if there's a risk involved. It's not like going sightseeing in Washington, D.C. and you're like, I'm going to go see the Lincoln Memorial today. And then you show up and the Lincoln Memorial is not there. He'll be there. Sometimes I'll have scaffolding around it, which is a bummer, but he'll still be there. So there's no guarantee you're ever going to see anything you set out to see. Even if you do the homework, the preparation, and you set yourself up for success, there's no guarantee. So you always run that risk, which can make it a little more stressful.
Can you talk a little bit more about your photography process? I'm assuming from how close many of these pictures seem that you probably weren't taking them on your phone, but what kind of setup did you have?
I have a Canon T5, which I've learned is actually not. It's good for birds of this size, for example. But some of the smaller ones I was trying to observe, I've learned that I might need to upgrade at some point. But I've always enjoyed photography. Even the ones of my kids that I shared earlier, those were taken with my regular camera. So I've always had a bit of a passion for photography. And one of the things that was also alluring about trying nature photography is the challenge involved. There's a chapter, the one I talked about a moment ago, the continuous pursuit of excellence. I'll stop sharing this. I actually have the Word document up, so I can try to pull this up really briefly. I was trying to copy and paste some of the excerpts. Let's see. All right, it's called the. Can you see my screen still?
Yes.
All right. It's a prairie warbler. All right. Let's see. Yeah, this is chapter 10. All right, so this is about pushing your button. So this is a picture of prairie warbler. Okay, and this is one that here's the first time I tried to photograph one. There he is, right? Isn't that neat? I call him the grainy warbler instead, but that's not a real thing. And then my second attempt, a little better. Third, I'm starting to get the hang of it. Third, this one here would have been perfect, but look at that dumb leaf right in front of his face. I mean, I was so mad at that leaf. I think it was possible to be mad at foliage, but I was cursing that leaf when I got home. That's just a joke, of course. But so the point is, this was darn challenging to get, which is why I continued to try to do it, because it was a way for me to continue to find, again, that outlet that I needed to, that was craving during that time of being out of work, with something that's going to be challenging to me and get me to sharpen my skills in something. So that's where that comes into play. But this was my first ever picture of a prairie warbler, and not a very good one, of course not. Since I have this document up, I can show you real quick what that burrowing owl looks like. That's actually kind of cool. And they are all over Broward County, and of course, picture's not loading. I'll try to find one really quickly, but that's probably the aspect of birding that I didn't really get into much in the book, is that the photography aspect, for me anyway, made it half the fun, because not only was it challenging to try to photograph a certain bird, it was also fun trying to guess what it is that you saw. And there was so then I'd rush home and I'd upload the photos, and I'd scroll through books to try to figure out what it is that I thought that I saw that day, only to find out it was something completely different.
Yeah, I see a comment from a fellow birder saying how difficult it can be to capture such elusive creatures. I also see a question that says, do you still find time to visit the Plantation Preserve Trail?
I've been once since August, which is really kind of a bummer. But I still try to get out there as often as possible, but not as often as I should. And I need to remind myself that's, I mean, and that's what I put in the book too. Like even going back to normal life that we're back in with kids' activities and work and all these other responsibilities, I promised myself I wouldn't fall into that trap of, being too busy for what matters most. But unfortunately, some days it's harder to keep that in mind. All right, here's one I found on my Facebook. Look at this little guy. This is a burrowing owl. This is where he was. This is him right there on that tree in Central Park. These things are tiny. They're not like, you think of an owl, you think of the big, great horned owls. This thing is probably the size of like a pigeon. But there he was that day.
I also want to point out for everyone that I just put in the chat, if you haven't yet read Matthew's book and you'd like to check it out, you can either email him at his email I put in the chat for a signed copy, or you can purchase it through Amazon Smile.
That's right.
Does anyone
There's also
have
a Kindle version on Amazon too, by the way.
Do we have any more questions? Feel free to either send them in the chat or unmute and ask them at this time. Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us tonight. I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's presentation as much as I did and learned something new. Of course, if you think of any questions later, you can always email us at info@poolesvilleseniors.org. I'd like to thank Matthew for his presentation, as well as our ongoing sponsors and private contributors that help us keep our programs going, because we love putting them on for you. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider joining us for more upcoming events. We'll be back this time next week with planets and more planets. You can go to our website, poolesvilleseniors.org, for more info and registration. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Matt.
So much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Matt.